Ubisoft really deserve to be congratulated on how they both elevated and completely destroyed the concept of the gameplay trailer with this title. This trailer looked so damn good at the time, not just for the graphics tech but also for the gameplay, that people just couldn't contain themselves. It felt like what they were aiming for was a truly reactive game world with a massive number of interactive elements. People acted like this game was going to be the best thing since fully 3D sliced bread. And then the actual game came out and showed that the gameplay demo was apparently just smoke and mirrors. Gamers back then already knew that screenshots and cinematic trailers were basically lies and not representative of the final product. But gameplay trailers were largely still seen as something that would at least somewhat showcase the final form of the game. Sure, there was that Killzone 2 trailer a few years earlier, but that one at least didn't go so far to include a HUD to fool players, and as far as I can tell, Killzone was never really a franchise that held a lot of mindshare among gamers. While reviewers at the time were generally favorable to Watch Dogs, that doesn't mean much because large AAA releases rarely get criticized by the mainstream press that factor into a game's Metacritic score. But many gamers, on the other hand, were far from happy, and that's what initially kept me away from the game for so long. I've heard some good things here and there about it, but a lot of the conversation was centered around a visual downgrade from the marketing materials. And that kinda made me suspicious, because nobody ever seemed to be talking about the actual gameplay or the narrative, and I never figured out why. Even after 2 sequels, Watch Dogs the franchise, much like Killzone, doesn't seem to hold a lot of mindshare among gamers, at least not anywhere where I see people talk about video games. So I finally decided to see for myself what the deal with this game was, because these stories of massive hype for games that don't end up making that big of a splash in the grand scheme of things are fascinating to me. I think the first point of comparison obviously has to be Grand Theft Auto 5. Back when Watch Dogs came out, there weren't that many open-world action games that took place in mostly realistic recreations of the real world, with characters that were just everyday schlubs and not some kind of superhero. And while GTA 5 might be considered one of the best games ever made, I have to play bad cop here and say that I was less than impressed by it, so any game that intends to emulate the later GTA games already has a handicap to overcome in my eyes. Still, it was GTA that popularized the formula of the open-world city with missions dotted all around the place. And I think Ubisoft are the company that truly showed how shallow this kind of game design can end up being if you go for quantity rather than quality. Before Watch Dogs, Ubisoft made a couple of Assassin's Creed games, which are largely identical to Watch Dogs in overall structure, minus the driving and the shooting gameplay. And again, I have to be a bit of a contrarian here, because I tried playing the Assassin's Creed games and was so bored by the end of the second one that I just couldn't bring myself to play any more of them. I think over the years the open world formula has just soured a bit for me. Back when I first played GTA 3 and Vice City as a teenager, they were excellent time killers with many varied missions to play. But as the years went on, more and more games opted to use the same formula, and it just became apparent that this style of delivering quests and gameplay doesn't appeal to me. I don't look at the world map covered in missions and think to myself, "Oh yeah, this game has so much content," but rather, "Oh dear, this game wants me to do the same 4 or 5 mission types over and over again in order to reach the required 30 hours playtime." There are examples of games that employ this kind of world design that I enjoy, like The Witcher 3 or the Saints Row games. But the thing that makes those games different from something like GTA, Assassin's Creed or Watch Dogs is that they have actually entertaining gameplay and writing that elevate the experience and make these repeated side missions palatable. So even if you took out the open world aspect, they'd still have a leg to stand on. Watch Dogs unfortunately is severely lacking in most of the gameplay it offers. As far as I can tell, it has 4 central pillars of gameplay: driving, shooting, parkour and hacking. So let's go through each in turn and examine what they bring to the table. Driving in this game feels like it's where Ubisoft took the most inspiration from GTA in terms of gameplay. Because much like GTA 4 and 5, driving feels abysmal in this game. Cars peel out at the lightest touch of the accelerator, and doing turns in some of the narrower streets of Chicago is just a nightmare. This is particularly the case for the more regular inner city cars, which have an extremely slow acceleration and terrible handling. Sports cars fare a little better, but overall the driving experience leaves a lot to be desired. Unfortunately, it's also not something you can avoid, because so much of this game is just commuting between places that you simply have no choice but to drive cars. I'm flabbergasted how a game of this caliber can ship with driving mechanics this bad. Did nobody on the dev team play the game and realize that driving simply wasn't fun? Your other mode of getting around is a simplistic parkour system like the one previously seen in the Assassin's Creed games, only much less generous. You can only scale objects that are slightly higher than Aiden Pierce, your protagonist, so forget climbing buildings without relying on scissor lifts that you can't move around. You're entirely at the mercy of the level designers to create linear paths for you to follow, instead of offering options for you to improvise here, and finding these routes can be quite frustrating. Especially for the mandatory quote-unquote towers that unlock bits of the map and add another handful of mission icons to it, as if there weren't enough already. This approach to progression was already a massive joke among gamers at the time this game came out, and I refuse to believe that Ubisoft didn't know about it. And yet, they still went ahead and implemented this godforsaken roadblock of an unlock mechanic in this game. As always, it just means that occasionally between missions you have to take time out of your schedule to do this little scavenger hunt in order to unlock the next bit of game. Shooting also feels underdeveloped. Gunplay is a chore because there seems to be some mouse acceleration in there, which makes precise and satisfying firing almost impossible. And unfortunately, I couldn't manage to fix the issue with editing config files either, so it persisted all the way through. And Watch Dogs for some reason seems very intent to turn things into a shootout fairly frequently, which is at odds with the whole hacking and infiltrating aspect that the narrative is supposed to be about. It even has sections where I methodically cleared out all the patrolling guards so I could just stroll into the compound and reach the intended computer that conveniently couldn't be hacked remotely, only for the game to then immediately spawn a tough enemy just outside of the room. In fact, the game overall has a real affinity for randomly spawning enemies, a typical hallmark of aggressively scripted games that offer absolutely no breathing room. Take the police, for example. During my playthrough, I rarely saw a patrol car anywhere in this city. And remember, this is supposed to be a game about mass surveillance that was implemented in order to deter crime. That's one of those CityOS facts that always gets broadcast to remind people that this oppressive Orwellian gilded cage is for their own benefit. Aiden uses a backdoor to that system to manipulate all the things connected to it, and it regularly alerts you to crimes that the system predicts are about to happen. So why is it my job to go after these criminals instead of the police, who ostensibly should also get these same notifications? I mean, I can understand why they don't do it if it's as annoying for them as it is for the players. You first have to scout out the area to find both the criminal and his victim, observe the crime happening, and only then can you intervene. And if you do it a second too early, even if you can already see someone pointing a gun at their victim, the whole thing aborts and you fail. Funny how deterring a crime before it can happen doesn't pay out a reward, but letting it happen and punishing the perp after the fact counts as a good deed. Someone call up Tom Cruise, we need to redo Minority Report all over again. Anyway, the only time the police do show up is if they're called in at the end of a mission, or whenever you commit a crime and a civilian calls them in, where they spawn in en masse and you have to evade them in some manner. If you do it on foot, you won't get far, since they respawn endlessly and Aiden is so squishy that he can only take a few rounds before he goes down. The only way out is to find an escape route, and that means getting into a vehicle. Once you do, the only means of either defense or attack are your hacking abilities, because Aiden can't hold his cell phone to hack the city while at the same time wielding a gun to defend himself. So forget shooting out tires to disable pursuing cars, you have to rely on hacking traffic lights, bollards, road spikes, bridges, or underground pipes. Or you can just try to get to a boat and ride out to open water where the police for some reason don't follow you. They do pursue you by helicopter, but if you get the upgrade to temporarily disable those, getting away is a trivial affair. The police aren't the only ones hunting you down, though. Over the course of the narrative, you'll be entering a variety of enemy territory, so be prepared to do this spiel of escaping or evading pursuers over and over again. It becomes old so fast because it adds this annoying, unavoidable sequence to almost every mission that has you infiltrate something in person. And again, it doesn't matter if you've managed to clear out the entire compound or disabled all the methods to call for backup, because the game just spawns in these pursuers at its leisure. But the biggest downside about it is that it clashes with the missions where you actually do have the ability to do everything remotely. Now, I have to say that the hacking in itself is very perfunctory. All of the environmental things you can hack only take a single button press, so in essence hacking is just a long distance use button. But what I really like about the hacking is that you can hack pretty much everything with which you have line of sight, and that extends to hacking things that are only visible through a camera feed. This means that you can park your car outside of an enemy stronghold, find a conveniently placed camera somewhere, scout out the compound, and even use some of the explosive elements of the environment to take out guards or burst pipes to lure them into traps you've set. The best missions are the ones that allow you to do everything remotely, ideally without alerting or killing anyone, with a close second being those that give you an option to do it stealthy without raising any alarms. At its best, Watch Dogs resembles the modern Deus Ex games to a frightening degree, both in terms of a mission's pacing as well as gameplay. It makes me wonder why Ubisoft didn't just do this as an immersive sim and let players decide how they want to tackle the missions, instead of rigidly outlining a script they necessarily have to follow, where shootouts just happen because the game decided that this is the point where the shooting happens. It's especially galling when at one point the game simply gives you an objective to clear out all the enemies and afterwards uses that fact as a punch to the gut for Aiden, because his nephew, who he's trying to get to through all of these enemies, observed everything through the security cameras and he wasn't aware of Aiden's violent nature. And I'm not entirely against the game forcing you to do something as a setup for later events of the narrative. Take for example the white phosphorus scene from Spec Ops: The Line. You have no choice but to use it, but the gut punch when you learn that you also bomb defenseless civilians nearby actually means something when contrasted with the narrative reason why you're there, and it's supposed to be just one stepping stone on a long stairway down the abyss for its main character. Watch Dogs on the other hand has a token what have I become moment, but nothing changes in the aftermath. You were free to kill as many enemies or even civilians and police officers as you wanted before that moment, and you're free to continue your rampage afterward. The game does have a binary morality system, but that one only seems to go down whenever you kill civilians or police officers in some manner. Somehow, the game thinks clearing out someone's bank account isn't immoral though, so that token introspective moment the game forces you to go through rings entirely hollow. And the only thing the morality system affects is how fast civilians are willing to call the police, so if you don't actively go around murdering everybody and try to maintain a low profile in general, you'll never end up with negative karma. But to get back to the topic of the game forcing gameplay for a narrative purpose, there's even a much better example of how to do it properly in Watch Dogs itself. There's a bit where Aiden purposely gets caught by the police to enter a prison to get to a person locked up in there. You have no guns, only your hacking abilities and the stealth system. It's actually one of the game's absolute highlights, because it encourages paying attention to your surroundings and not just doing the tired old chest-high wall pop-up shooting gallery. The first part of the prison sequence is actually so good that I'm all but convinced that the devs of Deus Ex Mankind Divided ripped it off a few years later for that game's A Criminal Past DLC, which also puts you in a prison as an inmate where you have to sneak around without weapons or augmentations, and that too was an amazing experience. Unfortunately, these experiences are few and far between because the game simply can't decide if it wants to be about hacking and infiltration or balls-to-the-wall action. Again, a better game would have gone the immersive sim route and let players decide what kind of experience they wanted to have, but Watch Dogs wants to have its cake and eat it, and as such has to pander to both the crowd that wants a sneaking game about hacking and covert operations, who groan every time unavoidable scripted firefights break out, and the people who are there for an action-packed adventure, who immediately get frustrated by the forced stealth sections and the perfunctory hacking. It's almost as bad as titling your game Assassin's Creed and then having most of it be about boring, repetitive sword fights instead of actual assassinations. Glimpses like that of what a good version of this game could have been constantly keep popping up. Take for example the QR codes. There are a bunch of locations where you can see parts of QR codes painted on buildings. You have to jump from camera to find the one where the perspective matches up so the QR code looks right for it to scan it. That's a cool feature that really adds to the air of mystery around DedSec, the hacking group much of this game revolves around. It gives you an opportunity to actually look at this open world a bit more, because for most of the game it might as well not be there. Similarly, the collectibles where you have to violate the privacy of Chicago citizens are interesting in principle, but unfortunately they never really lead anywhere. Sometimes they feature poignant scenes of real humanity, other times it's just a cheap joke that falls completely flat. But Aiden never comments on them, so they just stand there without context. A particular one that stuck out to me was when you hack into a camera in front of a dude who's about to commit suicide in full view of the camera, only for the gun to jam and not fire even though a round is chambered. That's some really powerful stuff and potentially really disturbing to watch. But then you head to the next one and it depicts a couple engaging in Russian roulette for sexual thrills, with an almost naked woman pointing a loaded gun at her partner. He repeatedly urges her to pull the trigger while she panics more and more until she's about to break down. And then you head to the next one where a couple roleplay a wife being seduced by a plumber with terrible porn dialogue. Or take the one where Aisha Tyler talks to someone on her phone about how ludicrous it is to worry about mass surveillance while you're looking at her through a hacked camera. Ha, 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 So clever. It's all over the place, and the fact that nothing ever comes out of it, that it never gets contextualized and only serves as a video game token to be collected so you get to unlock something when you did all of these, cheapens the experience. That's a problem with most of these collectibles. They never amount to anything worthwhile by the end. They just unlock vehicles or firearms as if either of those were worth caring about. And the biggest tragedy is that it misses an opportunity to say something here. I mean, this is a game about mass surveillance, and you're hacking into people's private lives just for the thrill of it. That could be used as a jumping off point to explore the ramifications of mass surveillance, maybe by giving you an actual incentive of doing them, but it also coming with some downsides as a result of you violating the privacy of random citizens. It truly exemplifies this notion that Ubisoft love to make highly politically charged games, but then have the gall to publicly announce that their games aren't intended to be political. And you simply can't have it both ways. You can't have a game about mass surveillance and a police state, about massive violations of privacy, gang violence, and government corruption and not be political. Unless, of course, you wimp out and only use these political overtones as set dressing for a narrative that has nothing to say and a game that doesn't want to be taken seriously as a piece of speculative science fiction that deals with the possible negative consequences of things that are already in motion in the real world right now, in favor of merely wanting to be seen as a random distraction for your players. I assume it has to be the latter one, because the game is also chock full of shitty minigames and repetitive side missions that don't serve the narrative or the theme and are merely there to stretch out the content that is already stretched so thin that you can almost see through it. Who seriously wants to do missions to steal and drive cars around with as little damage as possible with driving mechanics this bad? With gameplay this insubstantial, you'd think the narrative would be a big selling point, since it's the one aspect that dictates all the gameplay. But unfortunately, the story overall didn't really manage to maintain my interest for the entire runtime. The setup of the narrative is fairly simple. Aiden and his partner Damien are hackers who conduct various heists, with Aiden infiltrating a building and Damien doing most of the work on his computer. One heist goes bad when a third hacker starts interfering, and presumably the identities of both Aiden and Damien get compromised. Aiden tries to bring his family, consisting of his sister and her 2 kids, to safety, but he gets ambushed by an assassin who ends up killing his 6-year-old niece. The story picks up a year later when Aiden, with the help of a hired fixer called Jordi, and Clara, a stereotypical punk hacker chick, manages to track down the assassin in order to get to whoever hired him. In the meantime, Aiden has turned to vigilantism in an attempt to rid himself of the guilt of his actions having caused the death of a loved one. So Aiden is basically Batman crossed with Spider-Man, a techie, gravelly voiced superhero whose primary motivation is guilt, and he finds himself in a pretty stereotypical revenge plot we've seen so many times already that the girl who ends up dying doesn't even get to say a single word and doesn't get characterized in the slightest before she's offed. We're just supposed to feel sympathetic for the protagonist because of his loss, regardless of the fact that this incident clearly throws his whole life into disarray to the point where killing an untold number of criminals without due process seems like a totally rational thing to do. And this is quite heavily contrasted by how the girl's mother deals with it, because she moves on with her life and seems to really have a grip on things while also having to deal with not just her trauma, but also her son's, who obviously has all the reason in the world to require the therapy he's in. Honestly, as far as I can tell, Aiden's sister is just outright a far better, more reasonable person than the brooding, angsty Batman wannabe. From this fairly simple setup, things very suddenly get massively more complicated though, with the game having 2 to 3 concurrent plot lines open at all times for you to keep track of. The whole assassin business gets put on the back burner for pretty much the entire rest of the game, since Damien suddenly enters the picture and kidnaps Aiden's sister in order to coerce him to help him find out who the other hacker during the introductory cutscene was, since he too had his comeuppance after that job went south. I'm not even sure why he needs to kidnap Aiden's sister in order to get him to follow the lead, because Aiden is already trying to find out who ordered the hit on him that ended up killing his niece, so it'd be reasonable to assume that both things are connected somehow. But apparently both Aiden and Damien are too thick to notice that. Anyway, this leads into a plotline where you have to infiltrate a gang called the Viceroys. Your first plan involves blackmailing the leader's cousin to gain access to his hideout in order to gather up some data for Damien. That plan goes absolutely nowhere, and it turns out to be just a massive waste of time because the guy you're blackmailing fails with his infiltration and you end up having to get into the building yourself anyway to retrieve the data. This entire detour is purely there to drag out the runtime of the story, and fittingly it also features a mission that contains an almost game-breaking bug unless you purposefully limit the game's frame rate to 30 FPS. After that's done and you've gotten all the data, it turns out that it's encrypted, because of course it is. In order to deal with the encryption, you have to find a specialist, and the only person Clara knows who could do it is the guy who invented the encryption, a guy called Raymond Kenny, who worked for a company called Bloom and also helped create CityOS while he was there. Kenny went into hiding after trying to expose the dangers of CityOS, and of course must be convinced to help you by doing a bunch of random quests for him. After Kenny helps you decrypt the data, it promptly gets stolen by another hacker, so we're forced to do a bunch of missions to deal with him and get the data back, so again, another pointless diversion that drags out the runtime. Once that detour is done, you can finally decrypt the data, which reveals that the gang leader has been collecting dirt on pretty much everybody in the entire city, and also contains the info that the hit on Aiden was ordered by the mob boss Lucky Quinn, who is a figure that earlier came up when you got to infiltrate a sex trafficking auction that he held, and who is also responsible for getting the current mayor of Chicago elected. Said mayor is being held in line by Quinn because of a video he possesses that shows him killing his secretary. And Damien tripping over said video in the opening cutscene was the catalyst for the hit on Aiden that killed his niece, because Quinn needs this video to maintain control over the mayor he put into power. While that data is being decrypted, it's also revealed that Clara was the one that led Quinn to Aiden in the first place and enabled Quinn to order the hit on him, which results in her being unceremoniously dismissed from Aiden's team. Meanwhile, during one of your phone calls with your sister, you've managed to record a piece of background audio that Kenny manages to clean up to the point where it tells you where she's being held. So you bust her out of captivity and send her and her son out of town so nobody can have any more leverage on Aiden. You go after Lucky Quinn in the hotel where this entire story took its start and end up killing him. It's a fairly unceremonious affair, bookended by scenes that show that Quinn never really had a clue what roused Aiden in the first place, and that killing him is only a hollow victory for Aiden, because Quinn dies as an old man, having lived a long and comfortable life, while Aiden still has to live with the fact that his heist ended up killing his niece, regardless of who ordered the hit. It's actually quite a nuanced point, and it only further contextualizes the butterfly effect that initial accidental discovery of that video had. You'd think that that would be the logical conclusion to the story, now that all the questions have been answered, your family being safe, and the guy responsible for the whole mess having been dealt with. But for inexplicable reasons, the game just keeps on going, because unbeknownst to you, Quinn also put out a hit on Clara after she abandoned working for him once she joined forces with you. She dies while laying flowers on Aiden's niece's grave, a pointless and really mean-spirited death, especially considering that audio log of hers that you get to hear afterwards. But even now, we're not done yet, because clearing the mystery of who ordered the hit wasn't Damien's ultimate goal. He wanted complete control of CityOS and needed the data pertaining to Raymond Kenny in order to fulfill his deal with Kenny's former employer Bloom. But apparently that doesn't matter anymore, because Damien still gets full access and starts wrecking shit all around Chicago, so you have to upload a virus from 3 different locations in the city to stop him. Why it has to be 3 locations is entirely beyond me, but fuck it, the game wants a climactic showdown because it can't do boss fights, so that's the best we get. After that's done, you track down Damien, and shortly before executing him, Jordi shows up and betrays you for no reason. After quickly dealing with him, you kill Damien, and the game is finally over. Oh wait, we still have to deal with that assassin from the beginning of the game. For the record, I let him live, because I found all his audio logs that revealed that he was roped into this job under similar pretenses as Aiden because of Quinn threatening his family. As you can see, the narrative's priorities are completely misaligned, because nothing here is really about the dangers of a system like CityOS. It's all about tired old human drama which is entirely rote and by the numbers. There's nothing original going on here, and we never really learn much about these characters because the plot is always just about getting to the next mission, while the game desperately tries to convince players that it has a dense, rich universe behind it all by pretending that all the gang violence, mob dealings, and government corruption mean anything. It even repeats the mistake of the original Assassin's Creed by having an ending that acts more as sequel bait rather than reinforcing the conclusion of the game we've just spent 30 hours beating. So the story is needlessly convoluted while still being childishly predictable, and the gameplay is barely a step up from what GTA managed to do, with only intermittent glimpses of what this game could have been had it followed more in the vein of Deus Ex rather than GTA. Honestly, looking back, the outrage over the visual downgrade and the misleading gameplay trailers seems a bit quaint. Sure, gamers have every reason to be roused by misleading marketing. Developers and publishers should just make better games, not lie to us about the shit they're capable of making. But Watch Dogs isn't bad because it had misleading marketing and a visual downgrade. It's bad because it's a second-rate clone of an overused game formula that was already past its prime when GTA 5 came out. It's bad because it wastes your time with endless driving around and narrative missions that only serve as pointless detours. It's bad because it tells a story with an interesting premise that squanders all that potential in favor of telling a cookie-cutter crime drama tale. That's why people shouldn't care about this game, not because of how its trailers looked.